They say never mix business with pleasure. But what happens when your past walks through your office door wearing a suit and carrying a performance evaluation clipboard? My name is Jessica Martinez, and 3 years after I thought I'd closed, the book on the worst relationship of my life, my ex-boyfriend Ryan, became my new boss. Within a week, he'd labeled everything I did as inefficient. But here's what he didn't know about efficiency. Sometimes the most important work can't be measured on a spreadsheet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 5 years. That's how long I'd been at Brightwave Marketing Solutions when my world shifted on its axis. 5 years of building something beautiful in the heart of Austin, where creativity flows as freely as the coffee at South by Southwest, and relationships matter more than metrics. I wasn't just the senior marketing coordinator. I was the invisible thread weaving through every successful campaign, every satisfied client, every crisis averted before it could explode. Most mornings found me at my desk by 7:30, not because I had to be, but because I loved watching the office come alive. Elena Rodriguez, our brilliant graphic designer, would stumble in, clutching her oversized coffee mug with paint-stained fingers, already sketching ideas on napkins. Marcus Johnson from sales would be on his phone sweet-talking potential clients before they'd even had breakfast. Katie Williams, our eager junior assistant, would bounce through the door with enough energy to power half of downtown Austin. But I was already 3 steps ahead of all of them. I'd reviewed the overnight emails from our East Coast clients, flagged the urgent requests, and prepared briefing notes for the morning strategy session. Not because it was in my job description, but because I understood something fundamental that business schools don't teach. Success lives in the spaces between the official responsibilities. Take Mrs. Patterson from Patterson's Pastry Shop, one of our longest-running clients. Her bakery had been struggling to compete with the new trendy dessert chains popping up around Austin. The marketing brief called for a simple social media refresh, but during our initial consultation, I noticed something everyone else missed. She kept mentioning her grandmother's recipes, how they'd been in the family for 60 years, how customers used to drive from San Antonio just for her apple turnovers. The official campaign focused on Instagram-worthy photos and targeted Facebook ads. But I suggested something different, a storytelling approach that honored her heritage. We created a Grandmother's Kitchen series featuring Mrs. Patterson, sharing the history behind each recipe, complete with old family photos and handwritten recipe cards. I personally worked with Elena to design vintage-inspired graphics that felt authentic rather than manufactured. The campaign didn't just increase sales, it transformed her business. Customers started bringing their own grandmothers to the shop. Food bloggers wrote features about preserving culinary traditions. Mrs. Patterson called it a miracle, but I knew better. It was just the result of listening, really listening, to what someone needed rather than what they thought they wanted. This was my specialty, seeing the human story behind every business challenge. When the local yoga studio owner mentioned during a campaign planning meeting that she was worried about her elderly students feeling left out of the younger crowd, I didn't just note it for demographic targeting. I developed an entire wisdom. Warriors, sub-campaign celebrating mature yogis, complete with testimonials and specialized class offerings. The studio owner cried when she saw the final presentation. David Chen, our founder, used to joke that I had some kind of sixth sense for client psychology. What he didn't realize was that it wasn't magic. It was attention. While others focused on conversion rates and click-through percentages, I paid attention to the catch in someone's voice when they talked about their struggling business, the way their eyes lit up when they described their dreams, the small details that revealed what they really valued. My desk reflected this approach. While my colleagues had neat digital filing systems and color-coded spreadsheets, I maintained a collection of handwritten notes, client birthday reminders, and a Rolodex that Elena constantly teased me about. Old-fashioned, maybe, but when Mr. Gonzalez from the local auto repair shop mentioned his daughter's quinceañera during a casual phone call, I remembered. 6 months later, when we were launching his new customer loyalty program, I suggested timing the announcement during her party. The personal touch meant everything to him. The unofficial part of my role extended far beyond client relations. I was the person Katie came to when she felt overwhelmed by her first major project deadline. I was the one Marcus consulted when a difficult client demanded changes that would compromise the campaign's effectiveness. I mediated disputes between the creative team and account management, translated client feedback into actionable direction, and somehow managed to keep everyone focused during the chaos of multiple concurrent campaigns. Amanda Foster from HR once told me I had natural leadership qualities, but I never saw it that way. I just cared about people, about making sure everyone felt heard, supported, and valued. When Tom Bradley in IT was going through his divorce, I made sure he had coverage during his court dates without having to explain his personal business to everyone. When Elena was struggling with imposter syndrome after a client rejected her, initial concepts, I stayed late helping her rebuild her confidence and refine her ideas. The office culture at Brightwave reflected this people-first approach. David Chen had built the company on the principle that happy employees create happy clients, and it showed in everything we did. Friday afternoon celebrations weren't mandatory. Team-building exercises. They were genuine celebrations of the week's wins, complete with local barbecue and Elena's famous margarita recipe. When someone landed a big account or solved a tough creative challenge, the whole office knew about it. Our success spoke for itself. Client retention rates that made our competitors jealous, word-of-mouth referrals that kept our business development pipeline full, and a company culture that had earned us Best Places to Work recognition 3 years running. We weren't the biggest marketing agency in Austin, but we were arguably the most beloved by our employees and clients alike. My contribution to this success was largely invisible, which was exactly how I preferred it. I didn't need my name on the awards or recognition in the company newsletter. I found satisfaction in the small moments, when a struggling client's business turned around, when a junior employee felt confident enough to pitch their own ideas, when the office ran so smoothly that problems got solved before they became crises. This quiet approach had served me well throughout my career. While others jockeyed for attention and credit, I focused on results. While colleagues played politics and managed up, I managed the work itself. It wasn't that I lacked ambition. I just believed that excellence would eventually be recognized and rewarded. Looking back, I realized this philosophy made me vulnerable in ways I never considered. I was so focused on doing good work that I never thought about protecting myself from those who might not value that work. I assumed that competence and dedication would always be appreciated, that building genuine relationships and delivering results would insulate me from workplace politics and power plays. I had no idea how naive that assumption was until the morning David Chen called an all-hands meeting to introduce our new Director of Operations and Efficiency. I had heard rumors about bringing in outside expertise to help us scale more effectively as the company grew, but I figured it would be someone who understood our culture and values, someone who would appreciate what we'd built here. I certainly never imagined it would be Ryan Thompson, my ex-boyfriend, walking through those conference room doors with a folder full of optimization strategies and a smile that I recognized all too well. The same smile he'd worn when he used to critique my study habits in college, my career choices after graduation, my inefficient way of managing my own life. The same smile that had convinced me for far too long that his way of doing things was better than mine. Every successful marketing campaign tells a story, but the real story at Brightwave wasn't in our glossy presentations or award-winning creative work. It was in the intricate web of relationships, processes, and institutional knowledge that I had woven over 5 years of dedicated service. Like the root system of a massive oak tree, my contributions were largely underground, invisible to casual observers, but absolutely essential to everything that flourished above ground. My typical Monday morning started before most of Austin was awake. While the rest of the city was still nursing weekend hangovers and debating whether to hit the snooze button one more time, I was already 3 coffee cups deep into my weekly planning ritual. This wasn't mandated by company policy or dictated by any job description. It was something I did because I understood that in the world of client services, anticipation was everything. The client database on my computer told one story: names, contract values, campaign timelines, performance metrics. But the real intelligence lived in my handwritten notes, accumulated over countless phone calls, face-to-face meetings, and casual conversations. Mrs. Patterson's Bakery wasn't just account 47 with a monthly retainer of $8,000. She was a third-generation business owner who still used her grandmother's rolling pin, who worried constantly about preserving family traditions in an increasingly corporate world, and who had a tendency to second-guess every creative decision, unless you took the time to explain the reasoning behind it. Understanding these nuances meant the difference between a successful campaign and a disaster. When Elena first designed the vintage-inspired graphics for Patterson's pastry shop, Mrs. Patterson's initial reaction was lukewarm. A less experienced account manager might have pushed back, insisting that the design was on-brand and effective. But I knew Mrs. Patterson well enough to recognize her uncertainty as a sign that she needed more context, not different creative. I spent an hour on the phone with her, walking through each design element and explaining how it connected to her family's story. The sepia-toned photographs weren't just aesthetically pleasing. They evoked the warmth and nostalgia that her customers associated with homemade desserts. The hand-lettered font wasn't trendy for the sake of being trendy. It mimicked the style of her grandmother's recipe cards. By the end of our conversation, Mrs. Patterson wasn't just approving the design. She was excited about it. This kind of client education happened constantly, but it was invisible work that never appeared on timesheets or project reports. When Marcus landed a new account with a local fitness center, he handed me a basic creative brief and expected me to coordinate the campaign launch. What he didn't know was that I spent 3 additional hours researching the fitness industry in Austin, identifying the center's main competitors, and developing a comprehensive understanding of their target demographics' pain points and motivations. That research led to insights that transformed the entire campaign. Instead of preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Fitness messaging about getting in shape for summer, we developed a community-focused approach that positioned the gym as a place where busy Austin professionals could find balance in their hectic lives. The tagline, "Find your center in the center of Austin," became one of our most successful campaigns, generating a 30% increase in new memberships within the first quarter. But my role extended far beyond individual client accounts. I had become the unofficial keeper of Brightwave's institutional memory, the person who remembered why certain processes existed and how they had evolved over time. When new employees joined the team, they inevitably ended up at my desk with questions that weren't covered in the employee handbook. How do you handle a client who wants constant revisions without scope creep? What's the best way to present creative concepts to someone who doesn't understand design principles? How do you maintain professional boundaries with clients who want to become friends? These weren't just procedural questions. They were the kind of nuanced challenges that could make or break client relationships. I had developed informal training protocols, mentoring systems, and knowledge-sharing practices that helped new team members navigate these complexities. Katie Williams, our junior marketing assistant, later told me that my guidance during her first month had been invaluable in building her confidence and competence. The vendor relationships I had cultivated represented another invisible asset that couldn't be easily quantified or replaced. Austin's creative community was tight-knit, and I had spent years building trust with freelance photographers, copywriters, web developers, and specialized consultants who could enhance our campaigns when needed. These weren't just transactional relationships based on price and availability. They were partnerships built on mutual respect and shared commitment to quality work. When we needed a photographer for the local yoga studio's Wisdom Warriors campaign, I didn't just search for someone with availability and competitive rates. I reached out to Maria Santos, a freelance photographer who specialized in lifestyle photography and had a gift for making older adults feel comfortable and confident in front of the camera. Maria's work elevated the entire campaign, capturing images that felt authentic and empowering rather than staged or patronizing. These vendor relationships also served as an informal network for industry intelligence and problem solving. When a client's website crashed during a major campaign launch, I was able to connect with a developer who could provide emergency support within hours rather than days. When we needed specialized market research for a particularly challenging account, I knew exactly which consultant had the expertise and availability to deliver quality work under tight deadlines. The crisis management aspect of my role was perhaps the most critical and least visible element of my contributions. Over 5 years, I had developed an almost intuitive ability to sense when projects were heading toward potential problems. Clients' tone during routine check-in calls, subtle changes in their feedback patterns, delays in approval processes. These were early warning signals that I had learned to interpret and address before they escalated into major issues. When the auto repair shop owner, Mr. Gonzalez, started requesting more frequent updates on his advertising campaign performance, most people would have interpreted this as healthy engagement from an invested client. But I recognized it as anxiety, masquerading as involvement. Through careful questioning, I discovered that his wife was concerned about the marketing budget during a slow business period. Instead of simply providing more reports, I developed a simplified tracking system that showed return on investment in terms that made sense to someone without marketing expertise, and I arranged for Marcus to meet with both Mr. Gonzalez and his wife to address their concerns directly. This proactive approach to relationship management meant that Brightwave rarely experienced the kind of client crisis that could damage our reputation or derail multiple projects simultaneously. Problems got solved quietly, often before clients even realized there had been problems to solve. The smooth operation of our account management process wasn't the result of luck or simple competence. It was the product of constant vigilance, emotional intelligence, and deep commitment to client success. My influence extended into the internal dynamics of the company as well. Brightwave employed 45 people across multiple departments, and like any organization, we had our share of personality conflicts, communication challenges, and competing priorities. I had somehow evolved into an informal mediator, helping different departments understand each other's constraints and find collaborative solutions to complex challenges. The relationship between our creative team and account management was particularly delicate. Creative professionals wanted freedom to develop innovative concepts, while account managers needed to ensure that those concepts aligned with client expectations and budget realities. These tensions could easily escalate into departmental warfare, but I had developed a talent for translating between these different perspectives and finding middle ground that satisfied everyone involved. When Elena felt that Marcus was being too restrictive with creative direction for a new restaurant account, I facilitated a three-way conversation that helped them understand each other's concerns. Marcus was worried about the client's conservative approach to marketing, while Elena was frustrated by what she perceived as generic, safe creative choices. By bringing them together to discuss the client's specific fears and goals, we developed a phased approach that allowed for creative innovation within a framework that felt secure to the client. These mediation efforts required significant emotional labor and interpersonal skill, but they were essential to maintaining the collaborative culture that made Brightwave special. David Chen often commented on how well our teams worked together, compared to other agencies he had observed, but he didn't fully understand the behind-the-scenes work that made that collaboration possible. The systems and processes I had developed over the years represented another form of invisible infrastructure that kept the company running smoothly. The client onboarding checklist that ensured new accounts got proper introductions to all relevant team members. The campaign timeline templates that helped project managers anticipate potential bottlenecks and plan accordingly. the post-campaign evaluation protocols that captured lessons learned and best practices for future reference. None of these systems appeared in official company documentation, but they were embedded in the daily operations of every successful project we delivered. They represented accumulated wisdom about what worked, what didn't work, and how to navigate the countless variables that could influence campaign outcomes. They were, quite literally, the operating system that allowed our more visible successes to function effectively. The email arrived on a Thursday afternoon, innocuous enough that I almost deleted it along with the usual promotional messages and automated notifications that cluttered my inbox. The subject line read, "All hands meeting tomorrow, important." Company update, sent from David Chen's assistant with the typical corporate urgency that could mean anything from a new coffee machine in the break room to a major strategic shift. In Austin's laid-back business culture, we had learned not to panic over every important announcement. Friday morning found the entire Brightwave team crowded into our largest conference room, the one we usually reserved for major client presentations. The space felt different with all 45 employees packed together, our usual collaborative energy replaced by curious tension. David stood at the front of the room with an expression I had never seen before, excitement mixed with something that looked almost like nervousness. "I know you're all wondering why I called this meeting," David began, his voice carrying the slight accent that hinted at his family's immigration story, the same story that had inspired him to build a company focused on helping small businesses tell their own stories. "As you know, we've been growing rapidly over the past 2 years. New clients, bigger campaigns, more complex challenges. It's exactly the kind of success we've all worked so hard to achieve." Elena caught my eye from across the room and raised an eyebrow. We had both been part of that growth, had felt the increased pace and complexity in our daily work. The late nights had become more frequent, the client demands more sophisticated, the pressure to deliver excellence more intense. But we had adapted, found ways to maintain our quality standards and collaborative culture even as the company expanded. "But with growth comes growing pains," David continued. "We've reached a point where our informal systems and processes, while they've served us well, need to evolve. We need more structure, better efficiency, clearer accountability measures. We need to professionalize our operations without losing the culture and values that make Brightwave special." The word efficiency sent a small chill through me, though I couldn't quite articulate why. In my experience, when executives started talking about efficiency, it usually meant that someone had decided the human elements of business were obstacles, to be eliminated rather than assets to be leveraged. But David wasn't that kind of leader. He had always valued relationships and collaboration. Surely he understood that our success was built on exactly those human elements. "So I've brought in someone to help us navigate this transition," David said, gesturing toward the conference room door. "I want you all to meet Ryan Thompson, our new Director of Operations and Efficiency. Ryan comes to us with extensive experience in organizational optimization and process improvement. He's going to be working closely with all of you to identify opportunities for streamlining our workflows and maximizing our productivity." The door opened, and my world tilted on its axis. Ryan Thompson walked into the room with the same confident stride I remembered from college. The same perfectly pressed shirt and precisely knotted tie that had once made me feel underdressed and unprepared for adult life. His hair was shorter now, styled with the kind of precision that suggested regular appointments at an expensive salon. He carried a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most of our employees made in a week, and when he smiled at the room, I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. 3 years. 3 years since I had seen that smile, since I had heard that voice, since I had been forced to confront the version of myself that had tolerated his criticism and control for far too long. 3 years since I had finally found the courage to walk away from a relationship that was slowly eroding my confidence and self-worth. 3 years of healing, growing, building a career and a life that felt authentically mine. And now, he was, here, in my workplace, introduced as an expert who would be evaluating and optimizing everything I had spent 5 years building. "Thank you, David," Ryan said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone that had once made me second-guess every decision I made. "I'm excited to be here at Brightwave. From what I've observed during my initial assessment, you have a talented team and a strong market position. My role will be to help you build on those strengths while identifying and eliminating inefficiencies that might be holding you back from reaching your full potential." He opened his portfolio and pulled out a stack of documents, his movements precise and deliberate. "Over the next few weeks, I'll be conducting individual meetings with each department and team member to understand your current processes and identify optimization opportunities. I'll also be implementing new performance metrics and accountability systems to ensure we're measuring the right things and driving the right behaviors." The phrase "measuring the right things" felt like a personal attack, though I knew he hadn't even noticed me yet in the crowded room. But I knew exactly what Ryan considered worth measuring, and it definitely didn't include the relationship building, crisis prevention, and emotional labor that formed the foundation of my contributions to Brightwave. "I want to emphasize that this process is about improvement, not judgment," Ryan continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We're not here to criticize what you've been doing, but rather to build on your successes and eliminate obstacles to even greater achievement. Some of you might find these changes challenging at first, but I'm confident that once we implement these new systems, you'll appreciate the clarity and efficiency they provide." Marcus raised his hand from the sales team section. "What kind of time frame are we looking at for these changes?" Ryan's smile became more pronounced, the expression I remembered him wearing when someone asked exactly the question he wanted to answer. "I'm planning to complete my assessment within 2 weeks, with initial recommendations ready for implementation by the end of the month. We'll be moving quickly because I've found that prolonged transition periods tend to create more anxiety and resistance than necessary. Better to implement improvements decisively and allow everyone to adapt to the new normal." Katie Williams, our junior marketing assistant, looked nervous as she raised her hand. "Will these changes affect job responsibilities or reporting structures?" "Excellent question," Ryan replied, making a note in his portfolio. "Part of my assessment will involve examining role definitions and organizational structure to ensure we have the right people in the right positions with clear accountability measures. Some role adjustments may be necessary to optimize our operational efficiency." The room had grown quieter with each of Ryan's responses, the initial curiosity replaced by mounting concern. These weren't the kind of gentle improvements David had implied in his introduction. This sounded like a comprehensive restructuring that would fundamentally alter how Brightwave operated. David seemed to sense the shift in mood. "I want to reassure everyone that the core values and culture of Brightwave aren't changing," he said. "Ryan is here to help us scale those values and culture effectively as we continue to grow. We're not trying to become a different company. We're trying to become a better version of ourselves." Ryan nodded in agreement, but I caught something in his expression that suggested his definition of better might differ significantly from David's. "Absolutely. Culture is important, but it needs to be supported by efficient systems and clear performance standards. You can't maintain a positive culture if your operations are chaotic or your accountability measures are unclear." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with Ryan outlining his background in organizational consulting and process optimization. He had worked with companies across various industries, helping them streamline operations and improve productivity. His credentials were impressive, his experience extensive, his confidence unwavering. But as I listened to him speak, I felt a growing sense of dread that had nothing to do with his professional qualifications and everything to do with his fundamental approach to business and people. Ryan viewed organizations as machines to be optimized, with human elements that either contributed to efficiency or detracted from it. He talked about human resources, in the same tone he might use to discuss office equipment or software licenses. When the meeting finally ended, I remained in my seat as my colleagues filed out of the conference room, chattering nervously about what these changes might mean for their daily work. Elena lingered near the door, shooting concerned glances in my direction, but I wasn't ready to discuss what had just happened. I needed a moment to process the implications of Ryan's presence at Brightwave and what it might mean for everything I had built here. Ryan was still talking with David near the front of the room, reviewing some kind of timeline document and making notes in his portfolio. He hadn't acknowledged me during the meeting, hadn't even seemed to notice me among the crowd of employees. But I knew that wouldn't last long. Once he started his individual assessments, once he began examining role definitions and performance metrics, he would inevitably encounter my work and my contributions to Brightwave's success. And based on our history together, I had a feeling he wouldn't appreciate what he found. The email requesting a meeting arrived exactly 1 week after Ryan's introduction to the company. The subject line was professionally neutral. Operational assessment, Jessica Martinez, sent from an address I didn't recognize but knew belonged to the man who had once criticized everything from my study habits to my career aspirations. The message itself was brief and formal, requesting a 1-hour meeting in Conference Room B to discuss my current role and responsibilities as part of the operational efficiency review. I had spent the week watching Ryan move through the office, like a consultant conducting an audit, armed with his leather portfolio and an endless supply of questions about processes, workflows, and performance metrics. He observed team meetings, reviewed project files, and conducted interviews with department heads. Several of my colleagues had already endured their assessment meetings, emerging with expressions that ranged from confused to concerned. Elena had described her session as clinical, with Ryan focusing primarily on measurable outputs like design turnaround times and revision cycles. Marcus reported being questioned extensively about his sales conversion rates and client acquisition costs. Tom from IT had been asked to provide detailed time tracking data for every support request he had handled over the past quarter. The pattern was clear. Ryan was evaluating everyone based on quantifiable metrics and standardized processes. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how poorly my contributions would translate to his analytical framework. How do you measure the value of knowing that Mrs. Patterson needed extra reassurance before approving creative concepts? How do you quantify the importance of mediating conflicts between departments before they escalated into productivity-killing disputes? Tuesday morning found me sitting in Conference Room B 5 minutes before our scheduled appointment, reviewing the notes I had prepared about my role and responsibilities. I had documented every client relationship I managed, every process I had developed, every crisis I had prevented or resolved. If Ryan wanted metrics, I would give him metrics, even if they didn't capture the full scope of what I brought to Brightwave. Ryan entered the room precisely on time, carrying his portfolio and a coffee cup that probably cost more than most people spent on lunch. He looked exactly the same as he had 3 years ago, maybe a bit more polished around the edges, but fundamentally unchanged. The same confident posture, the same practiced smile, the same air of barely contained impatience when forced to deal with people who didn't immediately grasp his superior perspective. "Jessica," he said, settling into the chair across from me with the casual familiarity of someone who had once shared my bed and criticized my life choices over morning coffee. "Thank you for making time for this meeting. I hope you understand that these assessments are purely professional and focused on operational optimization." The disclaimer felt like a warning, as if he expected me to create drama or complications because of our personal history. It was exactly the kind of assumption Ryan would make, that I couldn't separate my emotions from my professional responsibilities, that I would somehow sabotage his process because of our failed relationship. "Of course," I replied, keeping my voice steady and professional. "I'm happy to discuss my role and how I can contribute to the company's continued success." Ryan opened his portfolio and pulled out a file with my name on it. I've been reviewing your position description and trying to understand exactly what you do here. Your title is Senior Marketing Coordinator, but when I look at the organizational chart and workflow documentation, your actual responsibilities seem to be somewhat undefined. The word hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that made my chest tighten. Undefined. In Ryan's worldview, anything that couldn't be clearly categorized and measured was automatically suspect, potentially wasteful, probably inefficient. I coordinate marketing campaigns and manage client relationships, I said, trying to summarize 5 years of complex work into terms he might appreciate. I serve as the primary point of contact for our major accounts and ensure that projects are delivered on time and within scope. Ryan made a note in his file. Yes, I see that in your job description. But when I examine the actual workflow processes, it appears that Marcus Johnson handles most client acquisition and relationship management for the sales team, while Elena Rodriguez and the creative team manage campaign development and execution. So what, specifically, do you coordinate? The question revealed exactly how little Ryan understood about the work I did, but it also presented a challenge. How do you explain emotional labor to someone who views emotions as inefficiencies? How do you describe relationship maintenance to someone who sees people as interchangeable resources? I manage the transition between sales and creative, I began, choosing my words carefully. When Marcus brings in a new client, I conduct the intake process to understand their business needs, communication preferences, and success metrics. I work with Elena and the creative team to ensure that campaign concepts align with client expectations, and I serve as the ongoing liaison throughout the project lifecycle. Ryan's expression suggested he found this explanation unsatisfactory. But that's just basic project management. Most agencies have automated systems for client onboarding and project tracking. It seems inefficient to have a senior-level employee handling administrative tasks that could be streamlined through better technology and processes. Administrative tasks. 5 years of building relationships, preventing crises, and ensuring client satisfaction had been reduced to administrative tasks in Ryan's assessment. I felt my face flush with frustration, but I kept my voice level. Client relationships aren't administrative tasks, I said. They require understanding, trust, and ongoing communication that can't be automated. When Mrs. Patterson from the bakery needs reassurance about a creative direction, or when Mr. Gonzalez has concerns about his advertising budget, they need to talk to someone who understands their business and their concerns. Ryan looked up. From his notes, with an expression I remembered all too well. The patient condescension he had once used when explaining why my approach to anything was inefficient or illogical. I understand that you've developed personal relationships with some clients, he said. But that creates dependencies that actually make the business less efficient. What happens if you're sick or on vacation? What happens if you leave the company? Professional service organizations need scalable systems that don't rely on individual personalities or relationships. The irony was staggering. Ryan was criticizing me for creating exactly the kind of client loyalty and satisfaction that had made Brightwave successful, while simultaneously arguing for systems that would eliminate the human connections that differentiated us from our competitors. Those relationships are why our clients stay with us, I said, struggling to keep my voice professional. Our retention rate is 93%, which is significantly higher than industry standards. That's not because of our systems, it's because our clients trust us and feel valued. Ryan made another note, his pen moving across the page, with sharp, decisive strokes. High retention rates can actually indicate complacency rather than excellence. Clients might stay because switching is inconvenient, not because they're receiving optimal value. We need to focus on measurable performance indicators rather than subjective relationship metrics. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Ryan systematically deconstructing every aspect of my role and finding it wanting according to his efficiency standards. My crisis prevention work was reactive rather than systematic. My cross-departmental mediation was an indication of poor communication protocols. My vendor relationships were informal arrangements that lack proper documentation and accountability measures. By the time he closed his portfolio and announced that he had enough information for his assessment, I felt like I had been systematically erased from my own job description. Everything I had built, everything I contributed, everything that made me valuable to Brightwave had been redefined as inefficiency or eliminated as unnecessary. "Thank you for your time, Jessica," Ryan said, standing and straightening his tie with the same precision he brought to everything else. "I'll be completing my assessment over the next few days and presenting my recommendations to David early, next week. I want you to know that this process isn't personal. It's about optimizing the organization for sustainable growth and improved performance." The disclaimer felt like a threat rather than reassurance. As I watched him walk out of the conference room, portfolio in hand, I realized that Ryan hadn't just assessed my role. He had already decided to eliminate it. The meeting had been a formality, a box to check off in his optimization process. 3 days later, I received another email, this one requesting a follow-up meeting with both Ryan and David Chen. The subject line was ominous in its simplicity. Role restructuring discussion. I knew with the sick certainty that comes from understanding someone too well, exactly what that meeting would entail. Ryan had found me inefficient, just as he had found everything about me inefficient during our relationship. And now he had the power to do something about it. The follow-up meeting took place in David Chen's office, a space that had always felt warm and welcoming despite its executive polish. David had decorated it with artwork from local Austin artists and photographs. Of Brightwave's team celebrations over the years, I had been in this office countless times for project discussions, strategy sessions, and informal check-ins. But today, the familiar surroundings felt foreign and threatening. David sat behind his desk, looking uncomfortable, which should have been my first warning that this conversation wouldn't go the way I hoped. He had always been direct in his communication, preferring honest conversations to corporate doublespeak. But today, he seemed to be struggling with how to begin, glancing between Ryan and me with an expression that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with what was about to happen. Ryan, by contrast, appeared completely at ease. He sat in the chair next to mine with his portfolio open, ready to present what I was certain would be a comprehensive argument for why my position was unnecessary and inefficient. He had spent 3 years perfecting his ability to dismantle my confidence and self-worth. Now he had professional justification for doing it again. "Jessica," David began, his voice carrying a note of reluctance that made my stomach drop. "Ryan has completed his assessment of your role and has some recommendations for how we might restructure your responsibilities to improve operational efficiency." The word restructure was corporate speak for elimination, and we all knew it. I had seen this conversation play out in companies across Austin, had heard the stories from friends and colleagues who had been restructured out of their positions in the name of optimization and efficiency. Ryan cleared his throat and opened his portfolio, pulling out a document that I suspected contained my professional death sentence. "Thank you, David. As I explained in my preliminary report, Jessica's current role represents a significant inefficiency in our operational workflow. She's essentially functioning as a middleman between sales and creative, adding an unnecessary layer of communication and potential delay to our project delivery process." The clinical language stung more than outright criticism would have. Ryan wasn't saying I was incompetent or problematic. He was saying I was redundant, an inefficient use of resources that could be eliminated without meaningful impact on the company's performance. "Furthermore," Ryan continued, consulting his notes with the same attention to detail he had once brought to critiquing my college papers, "many of Jessica's responsibilities can be automated through better project management systems and standardized client communication protocols. the personal relationships she's developed with clients, while well-intentioned, actually create dependencies that make the business less scalable and more vulnerable to disruption. David shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Jessica has been instrumental in our client retention and satisfaction rates, he said. Our clients specifically request to work with her, and she's been involved in some of our most successful campaigns. Ryan nodded as if he had expected this objection. I don't doubt that Jessica has contributed to past successes, but we need to think about sustainable growth and operational excellence. High-touch client management might work for a small agency, but as Brightwave scales, we need systems and processes that don't depend on individual personalities or relationships. The dismissal of everything I had built over 5 years was delivered with such casual confidence that I almost admired its audacity. Ryan had managed to reframe my greatest strengths as obstacles to the company's success, to position my most valuable contributions as impediments to growth and efficiency. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Ryan consulted his portfolio again, pulling out what appeared to be an organizational chart. I'm recommending that we eliminate the senior marketing coordinator position and redistribute those responsibilities across existing roles. Marcus can handle client onboarding as part of his sales process. Elena can manage client communication during campaign development. And we can implement automated systems for project tracking and timeline management. The reduction of 5 years of complex, nuanced work to a few bullet points on an organizational chart was breathtaking in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Ryan had essentially argued that I could be replaced by software and a redistribution of tasks that other people were already doing. David looked genuinely pained as he spoke. Jessica, I want you to know that this recommendation doesn't reflect any dissatisfaction with your performance or contributions. This is purely about operational restructuring and positioning the company for sustainable growth. The words were kind, but they couldn't disguise the reality of what was happening. I was being fired, albeit with corporate courtesy and professional justification. The fact that Ryan was the one recommending my elimination felt like the universe's cruelest joke, a cosmic punishment for having once loved someone who fundamentally didn't understand or value who I was. I understand, I said, surprising myself, with how steady my voice sounded. When would this restructuring take effect? Ryan and David exchanged glances, and I could see Ryan's satisfaction with how smoothly this conversation was proceeding. No drama, no tears, no emotional outbursts that would confirm his assessment of me as inefficient and unprofessional. We'd like to implement the changes within 2 weeks, David said. That would give you time to transition your current projects and client relationships to other team members. Of course, we'll provide a generous severance package and positive references for your job search. 2 weeks, 5 years of building relationships, developing systems, and contributing to Brightwave's success. And I had 2 weeks to wrap everything up and disappear. The timeline felt deliberately short, designed to minimize disruption and prevent any second-guessing of the decision. We'll also want to ensure a smooth transition of your client relationships, Ryan added, making notes in his portfolio as he spoke. I'll need detailed documentation of all ongoing projects, client preferences, and communication histories so we can maintain continuity during the transition period. The request for documentation revealed exactly how little Ryan understood about the work I did. He thought my value lay in information that could be captured in reports and spreadsheets, not in the trust and rapport I had built through years of consistent, attentive service. He wanted to extract my institutional knowledge and relationships, as if they were data that could be downloaded and transferred to someone else. Of course, I replied. I'll prepare comprehensive transition documents for all of my accounts. David looked relieved that I was being cooperative. that this difficult conversation was proceeding without conflict or complications. He probably thought he was witnessing a mature, professional response to unfortunate but necessary business decisions. What he didn't understand was that I wasn't being mature or professional. I was being strategic. I had learned, through painful experience with Ryan, that emotional responses to his criticism and control only provided him with ammunition to use against me. The best way to handle Ryan was to give him exactly what he thought he wanted, while quietly preparing for the consequences of his decisions. "I appreciate your professionalism about this, Jessica," David said. "I know this is difficult, but I'm confident that this restructuring will ultimately benefit everyone involved." The meeting continued for another 10 minutes, covering practical details about severance packages, final paychecks, and return of company property. Ryan took detailed notes about transition timelines and documentation requirements, already planning how to extract and redistribute everything I had built at Brightwave. As I walked back to my desk after the meeting, I felt a strange sense of calm that I hadn't expected. The shock and hurt were there, certainly, but they were overshadowed by a growing sense of clarity about what would happen next. Ryan thought he had solved a problem by eliminating my position, but he had no idea what kind of problem he had actually created. Elena noticed my expression immediately when I returned to my desk. "What happened?" she whispered, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "I'll fill you in later," I said quietly. "Right now, I need to start working on transition documentation." What I didn't tell Elena was that my transition documentation would be exactly what Ryan had requested: comprehensive, detailed, and completely insufficient to replace the relationships and institutional knowledge he was about to lose. I would document every process, every client preference, every vendor relationship, every crisis prevention protocol I had developed. But I couldn't document the trust, rapport, and emotional intelligence that made those systems work. Ryan wanted efficiency and optimization. In 2 weeks, he was going to get exactly what he had asked for. And then he would discover the difference between knowing how something works and knowing how to make it work. My final 2 weeks at Brightwave passed in a blur of documentation, transition meetings, and carefully neutral conversations with colleagues who sensed something significant was happening, but weren't quite sure what. I threw myself into creating the most comprehensive handover materials in corporate history, documenting everything from client coffee preferences to the subtle signs that indicated when a project was heading toward potential problems. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially writing my own replacement manual, trying to capture 5 years of relationship building and institutional knowledge in neat bullet points and organized spreadsheets. But I approached the task with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized my work at Brightwave, knowing that the quality of my documentation would speak for itself when Ryan inevitably struggled to make sense of what I had actually been doing. Elena helped me pack up my desk on Friday afternoon, my last official day at the company. 5 years of accumulated workspace personality fit into 2 cardboard boxes: framed photos, a small succulent plant that had somehow thrived under fluorescent lighting, coffee mugs collected from various client appreciation gifts, and the leather notebook where I had tracked relationship details and project insights that never made it into official reports. "This feels wrong," Elena muttered, wrapping my desk plant in tissue paper with the care of someone handling a fragile family heirloom. "You built half of what makes this place special. How does David not see that?" I had wondered the same thing. Throughout my transition period, watching David navigate the office with an expression of barely concealed stress that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the changes Ryan was implementing. But David had always been a numbers person at heart, someone who trusted data and metrics over intuition and relationship dynamics. When Ryan presented his efficiency recommendations with charts and projected cost savings, David saw improvement opportunities rather than potential disasters. He sees quarterly reports and operational efficiency, I replied, carefully removing my client contact information from the company database while copying it to my personal files. Ryan speaks his language in ways that I never learned how to. The transition meetings with my replacement team had been exercises in controlled frustration. Marcus would be handling client onboarding, though his sales-focused approach meant he viewed new accounts primarily as revenue opportunities rather than relationship-building challenges. Elena would manage creative communication, though her artistic temperament wasn't naturally suited to the diplomatic navigation required when clients wanted changes that would compromise campaign effectiveness. Katie Williams, our junior marketing assistant, would handle day-to-day project coordination, though she had been with the company for less than a year and still needed guidance on complex client management situations. Ryan had attended most of these transition meetings, taking notes and asking questions that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of what my role had actually entailed. He focused heavily on documentation and systems, assuming that effective client management was primarily a matter of following established protocols and maintaining organized records. When I tried to explain the nuanced art of reading client moods, anticipating concerns, and preventing small issues from escalating into major problems, he nodded politely and made notes about soft skills training for the replacement team. My last client calls were perhaps the most difficult part of the transition process. Mrs. Patterson from the bakery had been particularly upset when I explained that I would no longer be her primary contact at Brightwave. She had specifically requested to continue working with me, and when I explained that organizational restructuring meant Elena would be handling her account going forward, she had gone quiet in a way that suggested she was considering whether to continue the relationship at all. "But you understand my business," Mrs. Patterson had said, her voice carrying the kind of concern that came from years of struggling to compete with larger, more corporate competitors. "You know why the family recipes matter, why the traditional approach works for my customers. Will this Elena person understand that?" I had assured her that Elena was talented and dedicated, that the creative quality of her campaigns would remain high, that Brightwave was committed to understanding and supporting her business goals. But I could hear the uncertainty in Mrs. Patterson's responses, the polite skepticism of someone who had learned not to trust promises about seamless transitions and maintained service quality. Mr. Gonzalez from the auto repair shop had been more direct in his concerns. "Jessica, you've been managing our account for 3 years," he had said during our final check-in call. "You know my customers. You understand what works in this neighborhood. You've helped me through some tough financial periods. How do I know this new person will care about my business the way you do?" These conversations highlighted exactly what Ryan's efficiency analysis had missed: the emotional investment and personal commitment that transformed routine business relationships into genuine partnerships. My clients hadn't just been buying marketing services from Brightwave. They had been buying access to someone who understood their challenges, celebrated their successes, and advocated for their interests within the agency. That level of engagement couldn't be transferred through documentation or systematic processes. But I maintained my professional composure throughout these difficult conversations, providing reassurance and encouragement, while privately wondering how long it would take for these relationships to deteriorate under purely transactional management. I gave each client my personal contact information, carefully explaining that while I couldn't provide marketing services, they were welcome to reach out if they had questions or concerns about their ongoing campaigns. The office dynamics during my final weeks revealed interesting cracks in Ryan's confident assessment of organizational efficiency. Several of my colleagues had started coming to me with questions and concerns about the changes he was implementing, often speaking in hushed tones near my desk or pulling me aside during lunch breaks. Tom from IT was particularly frustrated with Ryan's new documentation requirements, which demanded detailed time tracking and productivity metrics for every support request and system maintenance task. "He wants me to log every phone call and email," Tom had complained. "He doesn't understand that half of my job is preventing problems before they happen, which means there's no ticket to track and no resolution time to measure." Katie Williams was struggling with the increased responsibilities that came with absorbing portions of my role. She had been hired as a junior assistant with expectations of gradual skill development and mentoring support, but Ryan's restructuring plan assumed she could immediately handle complex client coordination tasks that typically required years of experience to master. "I don't know what to do when clients ask for changes that weren't in the original scope," Katie had confided during one of our transition meetings. "You always seem to know exactly how to handle those situations. But Ryan's processes don't account for the gray areas where professional judgment matters more than following protocols." Even Elena, despite her artistic temperament and generally optimistic outlook, was beginning to express concerns about Ryan's approach to creative management. He had implemented new approval processes that required detailed justification for creative decisions that deviated from established templates or industry best practices, which effectively discouraged the kind of innovative thinking that had made Brightwave's campaigns distinctive and memorable. "He wants everything to be measurable and predictable," Elena had said during one of our afternoon coffee breaks. "But creativity doesn't work that way. Sometimes the best ideas come from understanding a client's story in ways that don't fit into standard frameworks." Marcus was perhaps the only team member who seemed genuinely enthusiastic about Ryan's changes, mainly because the new systems gave him more control over client relationships and campaign direction. As a sales professional, Marcus was comfortable with metrics-driven performance evaluation and appreciated the clarity that came with standardized processes and accountability measures. But even Marcus was beginning to encounter challenges that his sales expertise couldn't easily address. During a recent client onboarding meeting with a new restaurant account, he had focused primarily on campaign deliverables and timeline commitments, without taking the time to understand the owner's deeper concerns about competing with chain restaurants and maintaining authentic community connections. The client had seemed satisfied during the initial meeting, but follow-up conversations had revealed growing anxiety about whether Brightwave truly understood their brand identity and values. Jessica would have picked up on that anxiety immediately, Elena had observed after hearing about Marcus's client meeting. She would have spent extra time exploring their concerns and making sure they felt heard and understood before moving forward with campaign development. These small but significant problems were beginning to accumulate in ways that Ryan hadn't anticipated when he designed his efficiency improvements. His focus on eliminating redundancies and streamlining processes had created gaps in service quality and relationship management that were becoming increasingly apparent to both employees and clients. My departure date coincided with the launch of two major client campaigns that I had been managing through development phases for several months. The timing wasn't coincidental. Ryan had specifically chosen to implement his restructuring during a period of high project activity to demonstrate that the new systems could handle complex workloads without the inefficiencies he associated with my role. The restaurant campaign that Marcus had inherited was scheduled to launch the week after my departure, while Mrs. Patterson's seasonal bakery promotion was set to begin the following Monday. Both campaigns represented significant investments for the clients involved and had required months of careful planning and relationship management to bring to fruition. I had prepared detailed briefing documents for both projects, outlining client preferences, communication protocols, potential risk factors, and contingency plans for addressing common problems that might arise during campaign execution. But I knew from experience that successful campaign management required more than following documented procedures. It required understanding client psychology, anticipating problems before they materialized, and maintaining constant communication to ensure that everyone remained aligned and confident throughout the process. On my final Friday afternoon, I completed my last official task at Brightwave, sending a comprehensive email to Ryan, David, and the entire replacement team with final notes about ongoing projects, client relationships, and potential areas of concern that warranted careful attention during the transition period. The email was professional, thorough, and diplomatically worded to avoid any suggestion that I doubted the team's ability to maintain service quality without my involvement. But as I hit send and began shutting down my computer for the final time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching the beginning of a slow-motion disaster that I was powerless to prevent. Ryan's confidence in his efficiency improvements was absolute, and he had convinced David that short-term transition challenges would quickly give way to long-term operational benefits. Within a week, they would discover whether that confidence was justified. I had been gone from Brightwave for exactly 4 days when Elena called me on a Tuesday evening. Her voice tight with the kind of stress that suggested something had gone very wrong very quickly. I was at home, attempting to maintain some semblance of normal routine while job searching and processing the emotional whiplash of suddenly being unemployed after 5 years of intense professional engagement. "Jess, I need to tell you what's happening here," Elena said without preamble, the background noise suggesting she was calling from her car rather than risk being overheard in the office. "It's falling apart. Ryan's perfect system is falling apart, and he's blaming everyone except himself." The restaurant campaign that Marcus had inherited from me was the first casualty. The client, a family-owned Italian restaurant called Nonna's Kitchen, had been scheduled for a soft launch of their new marketing campaign on Monday morning. The campaign featured a combination of social media advertising, local food blogger outreach, and community event partnerships designed to increase awareness of their authentic family recipes and warm neighborhood atmosphere. Marcus handled the campaign launch like a product rollout, Elena explained. He sent the client a detailed report about metrics and performance indicators, but he didn't bother to check in about how they were feeling about the campaign or whether they had any concerns about the messaging. The problem had emerged when Nonna's Kitchen received their first wave of social media engagement and discovered that the tone of the campaign felt too corporate and polished for their family-oriented brand identity. The restaurant owners had called Brightwave on Monday afternoon to express concerns about disconnect between the campaign messaging and their actual restaurant experience, but Marcus had been in client meetings all day and hadn't returned their call. By Tuesday morning, they were panic calling the office, Elena continued. The daughter who manages their marketing was nearly in tears, saying the campaign made them look like they were trying to be something they're not. She specifically asked to speak with you, and when Katie told her you were no longer with the company, she went silent for like 30 seconds. The situation had escalated when Ryan decided to handle the client crisis personally, applying his systematic problem-solving approach to what was fundamentally a relationship and communication challenge. He had scheduled a conference call with the restaurant owners to review campaign performance data and discuss optimization strategies, apparently believing that detailed analytics would address their concerns about brand alignment and authentic messaging. "Jess, it was a disaster," Elena said, her voice carrying a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Ryan spent 20 minutes explaining click-through rates and demographic targeting, while the client kept trying to express their feelings about how the campaign represented their family business. He literally told them that emotional responses to marketing campaigns were less important than measurable performance indicators. The call had ended with Nonna's Kitchen requesting a complete campaign revision and threatening to terminate their contract if Brightwave couldn't better understand their brand identity and values. Ryan had agreed to the revision while privately expressing frustration about difficult clients who couldn't appreciate effective marketing strategies when they saw them. Mrs. Patterson's bakery campaign was experiencing similar problems, though the issues were manifesting differently due to her more diplomatic communication style. The seasonal promotion I had developed with her featured a heritage recipes theme that celebrated traditional baking methods and family food traditions, targeting customers who valued authenticity and craftsmanship over convenience and mass production. Elena had been managing the creative execution of the campaign, but without my relationship management and client psychology insights, she was struggling to interpret Mrs. Patterson's feedback and concerns. "She keeps saying the graphics are lovely and the messaging is very nice," Elena explained. "But I can tell she's not excited about it. There's something missing, but I can't figure out what it is, and she's too polite to directly criticize." the work. The problem was that Mrs. Patterson's enthusiasm for the original campaign concept had been based on extensive conversations we had shared about her family's baking history, her grandmother's influence on her business philosophy, and her concerns about maintaining tradition in an increasingly commercial marketplace. Those conversations had informed every aspect of the campaign development, from color palette choices to messaging tone to target audience selection. Without that deep understanding of Mrs. Patterson's emotional connection to her business, Elena was creating technically excellent creative work that missed the subtle elements that would have made the campaign personally meaningful to both the client and her customers. The graphics were beautiful, the messaging was clear, but the campaign lacked the authentic emotional resonance that transforms good marketing into genuine brand storytelling. "I keep thinking about how you would handle this," Elena said. You would have spent an hour on the phone with her, asking questions and listening to her concerns until you understood exactly what was bothering her. But Ryan's new protocols don't allow for that kind of time investment, unless it's specifically billable to the client. The efficiency measures that Ryan had implemented were creating artificial constraints on the kind of relationship maintenance and problem-solving that had previously been considered normal parts of campaign management. Elena was required to document her time in 15-minute increments and justify any client communication that exceeded established parameters for project scope and deliverable requirements. Meanwhile, Katie Williams was drowning in project coordination, responsibilities that required experience and judgment she hadn't yet developed. She was managing campaign timelines effectively and maintaining organized project files, but she was struggling with the nuanced aspects of client communication that involved reading between the lines and anticipating problems before they became crises. Yesterday, Katie called me in a panic because one of your vendor contacts was asking about payment schedules for a photography project, Elena recounted. She didn't know that Maria Santos always required 50% payment up front because of cash flow issues with her freelance business. Katie was following standard vendor payment procedures, which meant Maria wasn't going to start work for another 2 weeks. The vendor relationship problems were multiplying as freelancers and contractors discovered that their informal arrangements and personal connections with me hadn't transferred to the new project management system. Many of these vendors had provided preferred pricing and flexible scheduling to Brightwave because of trust and relationship history that couldn't be documented in standard contracts or procurement processes. Tom in IT is having similar problems, Elena added. He's been getting calls from vendors who used to work directly with you on campaign technology requirements. They don't understand the new approval processes, and some of them are starting to decline projects because the administrative overhead isn't worth it for smaller contracts. Ryan's response to these mounting challenges was to implement additional systems and protocols designed to standardize vendor management and client communication procedures. He had created detailed scripts for handling client concerns, established approval hierarchies for vendor relationships, and developed performance metrics for measuring relationship management effectiveness. But these solutions missed the fundamental reality that effective relationship management is inherently personal and contextual, requiring emotional intelligence and adaptability that can't be systematized or automated. Ryan was trying to solve human problems with process improvements, creating additional bureaucracy without addressing the underlying communication and trust issues that were driving client dissatisfaction. David is starting to notice, Elena said, lowering her voice, even though she was alone in her car. He's been asking questions about client feedback and project timelines. Yesterday, he asked Marcus specifically about the Nana's kitchen situation, and Marcus tried to blame the problems on unrealistic client expectations and scope creep. The most telling indicator of growing problems was the change in office atmosphere that Elena described. The collaborative, supportive culture that had characterized Brightwave was being replaced by defensive posturing and finger-pointing as team members struggled to adapt to new systems while managing increasingly difficult client relationships. People are scared, Elena said simply. They're working longer hours but feeling less confident about their work quality. Katie cried in the bathroom yesterday because she feels like she's failing at everything, and Marcus is getting aggressive with anyone who suggests that the client problems might be related to our internal changes. The conversation with Elena confirmed what I had suspected during my final weeks at Brightwave. Ryan's efficiency improvements were creating more problems than they solved, but his unwillingness to acknowledge relationship-based challenges meant that these problems would continue to escalate until they became impossible to ignore. As I hung up the phone that evening, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. I had been right about the importance of the relationship management work that Ryan had dismissed as inefficient, but being right didn't feel particularly satisfying when it meant watching something I had helped build slowly unravel. The real test would come in the following weeks as more clients encountered the new Brightwave approach to account management and campaign execution. Elena's call had revealed early warning signs, but the full scope of Ryan's miscalculations wouldn't become apparent until his systematic approach to efficiency encountered the messy reality of human relationships and client expectations. I suspected that wait wouldn't be very long. The first major crack in Ryan's facade of confident control came 2 weeks after my departure, though I didn't learn about it until several days later, when Elena called me in a state of barely controlled panic. Her voice shook as she described the cascade of events that had transformed isolated client concerns into a full-blown crisis that Ryan was struggling to contain. Mrs. Patterson had been the catalyst, though her complaint was delivered with the kind of polite diplomacy that masked its devastating implications. She had called the office on Thursday morning requesting a meeting to discuss her campaign performance and future marketing needs. But when Katie Williams tried to schedule the appointment using Ryan's new streamlined calendar system, Mrs. Patterson had made a simple but pointed request. "I was hoping to speak with someone who understands my business," Mrs. Patterson had said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle firmness that comes from years of dealing with suppliers and vendors who don't quite grasp what makes a family business special. "The current campaign is technically correct, but it doesn't feel like us. I need to work with someone who can help me tell our story properly." Katie had immediately transferred the call to Elena, who found herself trying to address concerns that went far beyond creative execution into fundamental questions about brand identity and emotional connection. Elena was talented and dedicated, but she hadn't developed the relationship history with Mrs. Patterson that would allow her to understand the subtle elements that were missing from the campaign. "I spent an hour on the phone with her," Elena told me, "and I could tell she was being incredibly patient with me. But she kept circling back to how the campaign felt wrong, even though she couldn't articulate exactly why. She finally said something that just broke my heart. Jessica always understood what I was trying to say, even when I couldn't find the right words." The conversation had ended with Mrs. Patterson requesting a meeting with David Chen directly, bypassing both Elena and Ryan's established communication protocols. She wanted to discuss not just her current campaign concerns, but broader questions about whether Brightwave was still the right marketing partner for her business. "That's when things got really intense," Elena continued. "Ryan found out about the request for a direct meeting with David, and he was furious. He kept saying that clients needed to follow proper channels and that allowing them to circumvent established processes would undermine our operational efficiency." Ryan had insisted on attending the meeting with Mrs. Patterson and David, positioning himself as the account relationship expert who could address her concerns through systematic problem-solving and data-driven analysis. But Mrs. Patterson's concerns weren't rooted in campaign performance metrics or process efficiency. They were about feeling understood and valued as a business partner. The meeting had been a disaster that revealed the fundamental disconnect between Ryan's approach to client management and the relationship-focused culture that had made Brightwave successful. According to Elena's account, Ryan had spent the first half of the meeting presenting campaign analytics and performance data, apparently believing that objective metrics would reassure Mrs. Patterson about the effectiveness of her marketing investment. She sat there listening politely while Ryan explained click-through rates and conversion percentages, Elena said. but you could see in her face that none of it mattered to her. When he finished his presentation, she looked at David and said, "I'm sure these numbers are important, but what I need to know is whether you still understand what makes my bakery special." David had tried to provide reassurance about Brightwave's continued commitment to understanding and supporting Mrs. Patterson's business goals, but his response had felt generic and scripted compared to the personal attention she had received during my tenure. Mrs. Patterson had listened carefully, asked a few pointed questions about staff changes and service philosophy, and then delivered a conclusion that sent shockwaves through the office. She said she needed to think about whether our partnership was still a good fit, Elena recounted. She was incredibly gracious about it, thanked everyone for their time and effort, but said she wanted to explore other options before making any additional marketing investments. When David asked if there was anything specific we could do to address her concerns, she just smiled sadly and said, "You used to have someone who could answer that question." Mrs. Patterson's departure was devastating enough on its own. She had been one of Brightwave's longest-standing clients and a powerful advocate for the agency within Austin's small business community. But her diplomatic exit had triggered a broader examination of client satisfaction and retention rates that revealed problems Ryan hadn't anticipated. David had requested a comprehensive review of client feedback and account status reports, and the results had been sobering. 3 other long-term clients had expressed concerns about changes in service quality and communication effectiveness. 2 clients had declined to renew contracts that were coming up for review. Several clients had specifically asked about my departure and whether it indicated broader changes in Brightwave's approach to account management. The Nana's Kitchen situation got worse too, Elena added. They ended up terminating their contract after another conference call with Ryan went badly. The daughter who manages their marketing told David that she felt like we were more interested in proving our expertise than understanding their needs. The loss of 2 major clients within 3 weeks of my departure was impossible to ignore or explain away through process improvement rhetoric. David had demanded a detailed analysis of client feedback patterns and account management challenges, forcing Ryan to confront the reality that his efficiency improvements were creating measurable damage to the business. Marcus was beginning to crack under the pressure of managing client relationships that required skills and experience he hadn't developed. His sales background had prepared him for acquiring new accounts and presenting campaign proposals, but he was struggling with the ongoing relationship maintenance and problem-solving that characterized long-term client partnerships. "He's getting defensive about everything," Elena explained. "Yesterday, he snapped at Katie when she asked for help with a client who was confused about campaign timeline changes. He told her that client management was part of her job now, and she needed to figure it out on her own." Katie Williams was approaching a breaking point, working longer hours while feeling increasingly overwhelmed by responsibilities that exceeded her experience level and skill set. She had been hired as a junior assistant with expectations of gradual development and mentoring support, but Ryan's restructuring had thrust her into complex client coordination roles without adequate preparation or backup systems. "She came to me yesterday asking if I thought she was going to get fired," Elena said. "She's convinced that the client problems are her fault because she doesn't know how to handle situations that you used to manage effortlessly." I tried to reassure her, but honestly, I'm worried about her too. The vendor relationship problems were escalating as well, with several key freelancers and contractors expressing frustration about administrative complexities and communication delays that hadn't existed during my tenure. Maria Santos, the photographer who had contributed to some of Brightwave's most successful campaigns, had declined 2 recent project invitations because the new approval processes required too much administrative overhead for smaller contracts. She told Tom that she misses working with someone who understood her creative process and could advocate for quality over cost efficiency, Elena reported. She said it feels like the agency has become more corporate and less collaborative. Achi. The cumulative effect of these individual problems was creating a crisis of confidence that extended beyond specific client accounts or vendor relationships. The office culture that had characterized Brightwave was deteriorating as staff members struggled to adapt to new systems while managing increasingly difficult professional relationships. "People are starting to talk," Elena said quietly. "Not just about specific problems, but about whether Ryan's changes are actually making things better or worse. Tom asked me directly yesterday whether I thought David knew how bad things were getting." David was indeed beginning to understand the scope of the problems, though he was still trying to process how such significant issues had emerged so quickly after implementing what had seemed like reasonable efficiency improvements. He had scheduled individual meetings with department heads to discuss client feedback and operational challenges, but his inquiries were creating additional stress for team members who were already struggling to maintain performance standards. David asked Elena and Marcus to prepare a detailed report about client satisfaction trends, Elena told me. Ryan is trying to frame the problems as temporary transition challenges that will resolve once everyone adapts to the new systems, but the data doesn't support that interpretation. The most damaging aspect of the crisis was the growing recognition among Brightwave's remaining clients that something fundamental had changed about the agency's approach to relationship management and service delivery. Word was beginning to spread through Austin's tight-knit small business community that Brightwave was experiencing internal problems that were affecting client service quality. Yesterday, I overheard a conversation at Grind Coffee between two business owners, Elena said. One of them mentioned that they had heard Brightwave was having staffing issues and might not be as reliable as they used to be. That kind of reputation damage is exactly what we can't afford in a community like Austin. The conversation with Elena confirmed that Ryan's systematic approach to efficiency had created exactly the kind of operational chaos he had claimed to prevent. His focus on eliminating relationship-based inefficiencies had destroyed the foundation of trust and communication that made Brightwave's client partnerships sustainable and profitable. As I processed Elena's account of the mounting crisis, I felt a mixture of vindication and genuine sadness about what was happening to the company I had helped build. I had been right about the importance of relationship management and emotional intelligence in client services. But being right didn't provide any satisfaction when it meant watching dedicated colleagues struggle with impossible situations and loyal clients lose confidence in an agency they had once trusted completely. The real question was whether David would recognize the connection between Ryan's changes and the mounting problems soon enough to prevent permanent damage to Brightwave's reputation and client base. Based on Elena's description of the office dynamics, that recognition was beginning to emerge, but it might already be too late to prevent significant long-term consequences. The phone call that changed everything came on a Monday morning 3 weeks after my departure from Brightwave. I was at home reviewing job applications and trying to maintain optimism about my professional future when Elena called, her voice carrying a level of panic that immediately commanded my full attention. "Jess, it's imploding," she said without preamble. "The whole thing is imploding, and David is asking questions that Ryan can't answer." Over the weekend, Brightwave had lost 2 more major clients, bringing the total departures to 4 accounts, representing nearly 30% of the agency's monthly recurring revenue. But more devastating than the immediate financial impact was the manner in which these clients had chosen to end their relationships with the agency. Gonzalez Auto Repair, the client I had managed for 3 years, had sent a formal termination letter that cited fundamental changes in service philosophy and communication effectiveness as the primary reasons for ending their marketing partnership. The letter had been addressed directly to David Chen, rather than going through normal account management channels, and it included specific references to my departure and the deterioration in personal attention that had followed. "Mr. Gonzalez didn't just fire us," Elena explained. "He wrote a detailed explanation of why he was leaving, and he specifically mentioned how much he valued the personal relationship and business understanding you had provided. He said the new approach felt transactional and impersonal, like he was just another account number rather than a valued partner. The second client departure was even more damaging to Brightwave's reputation within Austin's business community. The yoga studio that had benefited from our Wisdom Warriors campaign had not only terminated their contract, but had also posted a detailed review on Google and Yelp describing their disappointing experience with the agency's recent service changes. She wrote that Brightwave used to feel like a creative partner that understood her business values and community connections, Elena continued, but that recent changes had made the relationship feel corporate and disconnected. The review mentioned you by name and said that your departure had fundamentally altered the quality of service she received. These public criticisms were creating ripple effects throughout Austin's small business community, where word of mouth, recommendations, and personal referrals drove most marketing agency selections. Several prospective clients had recently canceled consultation appointments, and 2 clients who had been considering contract renewals had requested meetings to discuss their concerns about service consistency and relationship management. But the crisis reached its breaking point when David Chen received a phone call from Margaret Harrison, the owner of a successful local restaurant chain, who had been considering Brightwave for a major marketing campaign worth over $200,000. Margaret had been referred to the agency by Mrs. Patterson, who had specifically recommended me as the account manager she should request for her project. When Margaret called to schedule an initial consultation and asked to work with you specifically, Elena recounted, "Katie had to explain that you were no longer with the company. Margaret asked why you had left, and Katie gave some vague explanation about organizational restructuring. But then Margaret said she wanted to think about whether to move forward with the consultation at all. Margaret had called back 2 days later to decline Brightwave's services, explaining that she had spoken with several other business owners who had expressed concerns about recent changes at the agency. She had decided to work with a competitor who could provide the kind of personal attention and relationship-focused service that she valued in professional partnerships. The loss of this potential account represented more than just immediate revenue. It signaled that Brightwave's reputation damage was actively preventing new business development and growth opportunities. David was facing the nightmare scenario of an agency in decline, losing existing clients while struggling to attract new ones because of service quality concerns. David called an emergency meeting Friday afternoon, Elena said. Just him, Ryan, Marcus, and the department heads. I wasn't there, but Tom told me it was intense. David had printed out all the client termination letters and review comments, and he was demanding explanations for why so many long-term relationships had deteriorated so quickly. Ryan's response to the crisis had been to double down on his systematic approach, arguing that the client departures represented temporary transition challenges that would resolve once the remaining team members fully adapted to the new efficiency protocols. He had prepared a presentation about change management and organizational transformation, complete with industry statistics about normal client turnover rates during operational restructuring periods. According to Tom, Ryan spent 20 minutes explaining how client resistance to process improvements was predictable and manageable through better communication and expectations management, Elena continued. He suggested that the departing clients were probably not ideal fits for Brightwave's evolving service model anyway. David's reaction to this analysis had been swift and decisive. He had interrupted Ryan's presentation to ask a series of pointed questions about specific client relationships and service delivery challenges that Ryan couldn't adequately answer. The questions revealed that Ryan didn't understand the individual business needs, communication preferences, or relationship histories that had characterized Brightwave's most successful partnerships. David asked Ryan to explain why Mrs. Patterson had been dissatisfied with her campaign, and Ryan started talking about creative approval processes and timeline management, Elena recounted. But David kept pushing for specifics about her business concerns and personal communication style. And Ryan clearly didn't know those details. The meeting had escalated when David asked Marcus to explain the Nana's kitchen situation, and Marcus had attempted to blame the client's unrealistic expectations and emotional decision-making for the relationship breakdown. David had pointed out that Nana's Kitchen had been a satisfied client for over 2 years before the recent service changes, and their concerns about campaign tone and brand alignment were legitimate business issues that should have been addressed proactively. That's when David asked the question that changed everything, Elena said. He asked Ryan to explain exactly what Jessica had been doing that was so inefficient, and why eliminating her position had been necessary for operational improvement. Ryan's answer had revealed the fundamental flaw in his assessment of my role and contributions. He had described my work as redundant relationship management and unnecessary communication overhead that could be eliminated through better systems and process automation. But when David asked for specific examples of inefficiencies or duplicated efforts, Ryan couldn't provide concrete evidence that my role had actually created operational problems. David started asking about specific clients and projects. Elena continued, wanting to understand exactly how the transition had been supposed to work and why it wasn't working. Ryan kept falling back on theoretical principles about organizational efficiency, but he couldn't explain why clients were actually leaving or what specific problems the new systems were supposed to solve. The crisis had deepened when David requested detailed documentation of client feedback and service quality metrics from before and after my departure. The data revealed a clear pattern of declining satisfaction scores, increased communication problems, and relationship management challenges that directly contradicted Ryan's predictions about improved efficiency and service delivery. David spent the weekend reviewing everything, Elena said. Client files, project reports, feedback surveys, vendor relationships. He was trying to understand how we had gone from 93% client retention to losing major accounts almost weekly. The analysis had led David to a conclusion that was as obvious as it was devastating for Ryan's credibility. My departure had eliminated critical relationship management capabilities that couldn't be replaced through systems and processes alone. The efficiency improvements had created operational gaps that were actively damaging client relationships and business development opportunities. This morning, David called another meeting, Elena continued, and this time he invited the entire team. He announced that we were going to conduct a comprehensive review of recent operational changes and their impact on client satisfaction and business performance. The meeting had been a reckoning for Ryan's approach to organizational optimization. David had presented the client departure data, review comments, and feedback patterns that demonstrated clear connections between service quality problems and the systematic changes that Ryan had implemented. David was diplomatic but firm, Elena explained. He said that while he appreciated Ryan's expertise in operational efficiency, it was clear that some of the recent changes had created unintended consequences that needed to be addressed immediately. Now, Ryan had attempted to defend his recommendations by arguing that short-term client challenges were inevitable during any significant organizational transformation. But David had cut him off by pointing out that Brightwave couldn't afford to lose additional clients while waiting for theoretical benefits to materialize. Then David said something that made everyone in the room go completely silent, Elena said. He said that he had made a mistake in not better understanding the specific value that Jessica provided before agreeing to eliminate her position, and that he was going to explore options for addressing the relationship management gaps that had become apparent since her departure. The call from David Chen came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 weeks after my final day at Brightwave. I was sitting in my kitchen, laptop open to job search websites, when my phone rang with the familiar Austin area code that still made my heart skip a beat. 4 weeks of unemployment had given me time to process the end of my 5-year career at the agency, but hearing David's voice brought back a flood of emotions I thought I had already worked through. "Jessica," David said, his voice carrying a weariness that I had never heard before in all our years of working together. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. We need to talk." The conversation that followed was unlike any I had ever had with David during my tenure at Brightwave. Gone was the confident, optimistic energy that had characterized his leadership style since I had known him. Instead, I heard the voice of someone who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about decisions he had made and their far-reaching consequences. "I'm going to be direct with you," David continued. "The changes we implemented after your departure haven't worked the way we anticipated. In fact, they've created problems that I'm not sure we can solve without acknowledging some fundamental mistakes in our approach." He went on to describe the cascade of client departures, service quality complaints, and internal operational challenges that had emerged in the weeks since Ryan's efficiency improvements had been implemented. The picture he painted was even more devastating than what Elena had shared with me during our regular phone conversations. "We've lost 6 major clients," David said, his voice heavy with the weight of admitting failure. 6 clients who had been with us for years, who had specifically mentioned their relationship with you as a primary reason for their loyalty to Brightwave. The pattern is unmistakable, and I can't ignore it anymore. The conversation revealed details about the crisis that I hadn't heard from Elena or other colleagues. Mrs. Patterson hadn't just terminated her contract. She had written a detailed letter to David explaining exactly why she was leaving and what Brightwave would need to change to win back her trust. The letter had been a devastating indictment of Ryan's systematic approach to client relationship management. She wrote that marketing partnerships should feel like friendships, not business transactions, David explained. She said that you had understood her family's story and helped her share it authentically with her customers, but that our new approach made her feel like just another account to be managed efficiently. Mr. Gonzalez had been even more direct in his feedback, calling David personally to express his disappointment about the changes in service quality and personal attention. During their conversation, he had specifically asked whether my departure indicated that Brightwave was moving away from the relationship-focused approach that had made their partnership successful. He told me that marketing was about trust and understanding, not just creative concepts and campaign metrics, David continued. He said that you had taken the time to learn about his customers, his community, and his business challenges in ways that made him feel confident about investing in marketing initiatives. But the most damaging revelation was the impact that our client departures were having on Brightwave's reputation within Austin's small business community. Word had spread through informal networks about service quality problems at the agency, and several potential clients had chosen competitors specifically because of concerns about our operational stability and relationship management capabilities. Yesterday, I learned that we lost a potential contract worth $300,000 because the client had heard from other business owners that we were having internal problems, David said. The reputation damage is starting to affect our ability to grow and attract new business, not just retain existing clients. David's analysis of the crisis had led him to conclusions that were as painful as they were obvious. Ryan's efficiency improvements had systematically eliminated the relationship management capabilities that had differentiated Brightwave from larger, more corporate agencies. The human elements that Ryan had dismissed as inefficient were actually the foundation of the agency's competitive advantage and client loyalty. I realized that I had made a fundamental error in judgment, David admitted. I had trusted Ryan's assessment of your role without fully understanding what you actually contributed to our success. I let process optimization override relationship management, and I'm watching the business suffer because of that decision. The conversation took an unexpected turn when David began describing the internal dynamics that had emerged since my departure. The collaborative, supportive culture that had characterized Brightwave was being replaced by stress, finger-pointing, and declining morale as team members struggled to manage responsibilities they weren't prepared for. Katie Williams is working 12-hour days and still feels like she's failing, David said. Elena is talented but overwhelmed by client communication responsibilities that require experience she hasn't had time to develop. Marcus is defensive about client relationship problems that he doesn't know how to solve. Even Ryan was beginning to show cracks in his confident facade, though he continued to argue that the problems were temporary transition challenges rather than fundamental flaws in his approach. He had proposed additional training programs and process refinements to address the client satisfaction issues, but his solutions consistently missed the core relationship management challenges that were driving the problems. Ryan keeps talking about systems and protocols, David explained. But what our clients want is someone who understands their businesses and cares about their success. They want relationships, not efficiency metrics. The most telling moment in our conversation came when David asked me a question that revealed how completely he had misunderstood the nature of my contributions during my time at Brightwave. "Jessica, I need you to help me understand something," he said. "When Ryan presented his analysis of your role, he convinced me that your responsibilities could be distributed among existing team members without affecting service quality. But it's clear that we lost capabilities that can't be replaced through better organization or training. What was I missing?" The question gave me an opportunity to articulate something I had never been able to explain effectively during my tenure at the agency: the invisible emotional labor and relationship intelligence that had characterized much of my work. I had always struggled to quantify these contributions in ways that corporate leadership could appreciate, but the crisis had made their value undeniably apparent. "David, my job was never just about coordinating projects or managing client communication," I began. "It was about understanding each client as an individual business owner with unique challenges, fears, and aspirations. Mrs. Patterson didn't just need marketing services. She needed someone who understood why preserving her family's baking traditions mattered to her identity and her customers." I explained how my relationship management work had involved constant emotional intelligence and psychological insight that couldn't be systematized or delegated to team members without extensive experience and natural aptitude for interpersonal dynamics. When Mr. Gonzalez called with concerns about his advertising budget, I didn't just address his immediate questions. I continued. I recognized that his anxiety was really about cash flow pressures and competition from chain auto repair shops. The conversation we had about marketing ROI was actually about helping him feel confident about his business decisions during a challenging period. David listened intently as I described the crisis prevention work that had been invisible during my tenure but became glaringly apparent in its absence. The early warning signs that indicated when clients were becoming dissatisfied, the relationship maintenance that prevented small concerns from escalating into major problems, the advocacy work that ensured client needs were prioritized during internal discussions about project scope and resource allocation. I spent hours every week on relationship maintenance that never appeared on timesheets or project reports, I explained. Phone calls to check in on campaign performance, emails to clarify client feedback, informal conversations that helped me understand changing business priorities and market conditions. But perhaps most importantly, I had served as a cultural bridge between Brightwave's creative, collaborative internal environment and the diverse communication styles and business philosophies of our clients. Some clients needed detailed explanations and frequent updates, while others preferred high-level summaries and minimal contact. Some clients made decisions quickly and trusted professional recommendations, while others required extensive consultation and reassurance before approving campaign changes. My role was to translate between our internal capabilities and each client's individual needs and preferences, I said. That kind of customization requires understanding people as individuals, not just implementing standardized processes. As our conversation continued, David began to understand how Ryan's systematic approach had eliminated precisely the human elements that had made Brightwave special and successful. The efficiency improvements had treated client relationships as administrative challenges rather than ongoing partnerships that required constant attention and emotional investment. Ryan kept saying that professional relationships should be scalable and predictable, David reflected. But what made our clients loyal wasn't predictability. It was feeling understood and valued as individual business partners. The conversation reached its turning point when David asked the question I had been expecting since he first called. "Jessica, I know this is a lot to ask given how everything happened," he said, "but would you consider coming back? Not to your old position, but to a role that recognizes and compensates the relationship management expertise that we clearly can't function without." The offer wasn't entirely unexpected. Elena had hinted that David was beginning to understand the scope of the problems created by my departure. But hearing it directly from David forced me to confront questions about forgiveness, professional growth, and whether it was possible to rebuild trust with an organization that had so thoroughly undervalued my contributions. "I need you to understand that this isn't just about bringing you back to fix immediate problems," David continued. "I want to fundamentally restructure how we approach client relationship management and ensure that the expertise you provide is properly supported and recognized." The proposal he outlined was comprehensive and reflected a genuine understanding of what had gone wrong during my tenure and departure. He was offering a senior director of client relations position with direct reporting to him, oversight of all account management functions, and authority to hire and develop a team of relationship managers who could scale the personalized approach that had been my specialty. "I want you to build the relationship management function that Ryan convinced me was unnecessary," David said. "I want you to create systems that preserve the human elements of client service while providing the structure and support that will help us grow without losing what makes us special." The salary increase was substantial, reflecting both the seniority of the new role and David's recognition that he had systematically undervalued my contributions for years. But more important than the financial terms was the acknowledgement that relationship management was a core business function that required expertise, resources, and strategic priority within the organization. "There's one more thing," David added. "Ryan's consulting engagement will be ending. His contract was structured around achieving specific efficiency improvements and client satisfaction targets, and the data clearly shows that those objectives haven't been met." The news that Ryan would be leaving Brightwave provided a sense of closure that I hadn't expected to feel. His systematic dismantling of everything I had built would be reversed, and I would have the opportunity to rebuild those capabilities with proper support and recognition. But accepting David's offer would require more than just forgiving the professional slight of my departure. It would mean working to rebuild trust with colleagues who had watched me be eliminated and had struggled to function without the support I had provided. It would mean confronting the damage that had been done to client relationships and finding ways to restore confidence in Brightwave's commitment to personalized service. "I need some time to think about this," I told David. "The offer is generous and the role sounds exactly like what I would want to build at any agency. But I need to be sure that the cultural and structural changes you're describing will actually be implemented and sustained." David agreed to give me a week to consider the offer and suggested that we schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss specific details about role responsibilities, team development, and organizational changes that would support the relationship management function he wanted me to build. As I hung up the phone, I felt a complex mixture of vindication, opportunity, and uncertainty about whether returning to Brightwave was the right decision for my career and personal growth. The crisis had proven that my work had been valuable and necessary, but it had also revealed how easily that value could be dismissed and eliminated by leaders who didn't understand its importance. The next week would give me time to process David's offer and decide whether I was ready to rebuild something that had been so thoroughly dismantled. The follow-up meeting with David took place the following Tuesday at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory that felt more conducive to honest conversation than the Brightwave office where Ryan's presence still lingered in conference rooms and efficiency protocols. David looked older than I remembered, stress lines around his eyes that suggested the past month had aged him considerably. "Before we talk about the specifics of coming back," I said, settling into my chair with a coffee that actually tasted good after weeks of making do with whatever was cheapest at the grocery store, "I need to understand exactly what went wrong and what you're planning to do differently." David's response revealed the depth of analysis he had conducted into the client crisis and operational problems that had emerged since my departure. He had spent the weekend reviewing every client file, every project report, every piece of feedback that had been collected over the past month, trying to understand the specific mechanisms by which Brightwave's service quality had deteriorated so rapidly. The pattern was unmistakable once I forced myself to see it, David said. Every client complaint, every relationship problem, every service quality issue could be traced back to the elimination of relationship management capabilities that you had provided. He described how Mrs. Patterson's campaign dissatisfaction hadn't been about creative quality or strategic direction, but about feeling like her personal connection to the agency had been severed. The campaign Elena had developed was technically excellent, but it lacked the emotional resonance that came from deep understanding of Mrs. Patterson's family history and business philosophy. She told me that marketing should feel like storytelling, not like filling out forms, David explained. She said that you had always understood the story she wanted to tell about her bakery, but that our new approach made her feel like we were just executing creative tasks without understanding why they mattered. The Nana's kitchen disaster had revealed similar problems with Marcus's sales-focused approach to relationship management. He had treated their concerns about campaign tone and brand alignment as scope creep rather than legitimate feedback about messaging effectiveness, creating conflict where patient listening and collaborative problem-solving would have strengthened the partnership. Marcus kept trying to educate them about marketing best practices instead of understanding their concerns about authentic representation. David continued. He couldn't see that their emotional response to the campaign was valuable information about brand alignment, not an obstacle to overcome. But the most damaging revelation was how Ryan's systematic approach had eliminated the early warning systems that had prevented small problems from escalating into client departures. The informal check-ins, relationship maintenance conversations, and proactive problem-solving that had characterized my work had been dismissed as inefficient time allocation rather than essential business protection. I realized that you had been functioning as our client retention system, David said. You were identifying and addressing satisfaction issues before they became complaints, maintaining loyalty through personal attention and advocacy. When we eliminated that function, we lost our ability to prevent client departures. David's analysis had led him to conclusions about organizational structure and resource allocation that represented a fundamental shift from the efficiency-focused approach that Ryan had advocated. Instead of viewing relationship management as administrative overhead, he now understood it as a core competency that required investment, expertise, and strategic priority. I want to offer you the Director of Client Experience position, David E. said, with full authority to build the relationship management function that our agency needs to succeed. You would report directly to me, have budget authority for your team and programs, and play a key role in strategic decision-making about service delivery and client satisfaction. The title was more than cosmetic recognition. It represented acknowledgement that client relationship management was a senior executive function rather than administrative support work. The reporting structure would give me direct access to leadership decision-making and ensure that relationship management perspectives were included in all strategic planning discussions. I want you to hire and train a team of relationship managers who can scale the personalized approach that made you so effective, David continued. People who understand that client service is about emotional intelligence and individual attention, not just process efficiency and standardized protocols. But the most significant aspect of his offer was the mandate to restructure Brightwave's operational culture to prioritize relationship quality alongside project delivery and creative excellence. He wanted me to develop training programs for the entire staff about client psychology and communication effectiveness, ensuring that everyone understood their role in maintaining client satisfaction and loyalty. I'm not just offering you a job, David said. I'm asking you to help me rebuild this agency's approach to client service and relationship management. I want you to create the systems and culture that will prevent us from ever again undervaluing the human elements that make professional partnerships successful. The conversation turned to specific terms and conditions that would govern my return to Brightwave. The salary increase was substantial, nearly 40% above my previous compensation, reflecting both the seniority of the new role and David's recognition that he had systematically underpaid me for years of executive-level contributions. But more important than financial compensation were the structural changes David was prepared to implement to ensure that relationship management capabilities would be properly supported and protected going forward. He was proposing to create a client experience department with dedicated budget allocation, hiring authority, and strategic input into all major business decisions affecting service delivery. I want you to have the resources and authority you need to do this work effectively, David explained. That means administrative support, technology investments, professional development budgets, and decision-making power over client relationship policies and procedures. The scope of authority he was describing represented a complete reversal of the marginalization I had experienced during my previous tenure. Instead of being viewed as administrative support for other departments, I would be leading a core business function with equal standing to creative, sales, and operations teams. There's something else, David added. I want you to help me evaluate and restructure some of the other changes that Ryan implemented. His efficiency improvements affected more than just your role, and I'm starting to question whether other modifications might be creating problems we haven't recognized yet. The invitation to help undo Ryan's systematic changes felt like the ultimate vindication of my perspective on organizational culture and relationship management. David was essentially asking me to lead a comprehensive review of operational modifications and recommend which changes should be reversed or modified to better support collaborative culture and client satisfaction. I'm particularly concerned about the vendor relationship changes, David continued. Several of our freelance partners have expressed frustration about new administrative requirements and approval processes. I want you to evaluate whether those changes are actually improving efficiency or just creating bureaucratic obstacles. The conversation revealed that David's understanding of the crisis extended beyond immediate client departures to encompass broader questions about organizational identity and competitive positioning. He was beginning to recognize that Brightwave's success had been built on cultural elements that couldn't be optimized through systematic process improvements. Our competitive advantage was never operational efficiency, David reflected. It was our ability to understand and serve clients as individual business partners rather than account numbers. Ryan's approach systematically eliminated the capabilities that made us distinctive in the market. As we discussed the specific timeline for my return and the initial priorities for rebuilding client relationship management capabilities, David asked me a question that revealed his genuine commitment to learning from the mistakes that had led to the crisis. What do I need to do differently as a leader to ensure that I don't make similar errors in judgment? He asked. How do I better understand and protect the aspects of our culture and operations that aren't easily measured, but are essential to our success? The question provided an opportunity to address one of the fundamental problems that had enabled Ryan's misguided assessment of my role and contributions. David's leadership style had always emphasized data-driven decision-making and quantitative performance analysis, which made him vulnerable to arguments that dismissed relationship management as immeasurable and therefore unnecessary. You need to develop better ways of measuring and understanding relationship quality and client satisfaction, I suggested. Not just survey scores and retention rates, but deeper insights into how clients experience their partnerships with us and what drives their loyalty and advocacy. I proposed implementing regular client feedback sessions, relationship quality assessments, and internal culture surveys that would provide early warning signs if operational changes were negatively affecting service delivery or employee satisfaction. The goal would be to create data-driven insights into traditionally soft aspects of business performance. I also think you need to be more skeptical of consultants who promise dramatic improvements through systematic changes, I added. Organizational. Culture and client relationships are complex systems that can be damaged easily and rebuilt slowly. Major changes should be implemented gradually with careful monitoring of their effects. David agreed to implement these feedback mechanisms and committed to involving me in any future decisions about organizational restructuring or operational modifications. The new role would include responsibility for monitoring and protecting Brightwave's cultural elements that contributed to client satisfaction and employee engagement. "When do you want to start?" David asked. "Monday," I replied without hesitation. "But I have some conditions beyond what we've already discussed. The conditions I outlined were designed to ensure that my return would be successful and sustainable, rather than a temporary fix for immediate problems. I wanted written documentation of my role, responsibilities, and authority, clear performance metrics that included both quantitative and qualitative measures, and guaranteed involvement in all strategic planning discussions that could affect client relationship management. I also want to address the Ryan situation directly," I said. "If his consulting engagement is ending, I need to understand the timeline and transition plan. I can't rebuild effective systems while competing with conflicting approaches to client service and operational management." David assured me that Ryan's departure was already scheduled for the following week, with his contract termination based on failure to achieve the efficiency and satisfaction improvements that had justified his engagement. There would be no overlap between Ryan's consulting work and my return to the agency. His final report will acknowledge that the relationship management changes were unsuccessful and recommend reversing most of the modifications that affected client service delivery, David explained. "Essentially, he'll be documenting why your approach was correct and his approach was flawed." The irony of Ryan being forced to admit the value of relationship management capabilities he had dismissed was satisfying, but not surprising. The crisis had provided objective evidence that relationship intelligence and emotional labor were essential business functions rather than inefficient administrative overhead. As we concluded our meeting, David asked one final question that revealed his understanding of what my return would mean for Brightwave's future direction and competitive positioning. "Are you ready to build something better than what we had before?" he asked. "Not just to restore what was lost, but to create relationship management capabilities that will make us stronger and more successful than we've ever been?" The challenge he was describing was exactly what I had dreamed about during my years of operating without proper recognition or resources. The opportunity to build a comprehensive client experience function from the ground up, with full support and authority, to implement best practices and innovative approaches to relationship management. "Yes," I said, "let's build something extraordinary."